So after this presentation, mainly about also the first part of the loop, we go to the bottom with the production of construction and demolition waste that unfortunately is a big slice of non-municipal waste production. Next slide. So this is a short, no, you cannot see in the big screen? It's not moving on in the big screen. Okay. We can move on so we can be quicker. This is just a short agenda with the topics of the presentation. We can move on. Next one. Okay, thank you. So it has already been introduced what the Waste Framework Directive says related to construction and demolition waste. We have a new definition in the recast of the directive about construction and demolition waste, and also a recall to selective demolition in Article 11. We also have in Article 11 a new comma, number 6, stating that by 31st December 2024, the Commission can set a new target for recycling for construction and demolition waste, and also the material-specific fractions. What is the production in Italy of construction and demolition waste according to the 2021 report of the production of non-municipal waste? It's a huge percentage. As you can see, the orange part is a construction demolition waste that is more or less half of the production of total non-municipal waste, so we can say industrial waste in Italy. In 2019, it was a production of 68,000 tons of construction and demolition waste, so the biggest slides of the total production. As we can see in this diagram, these are the EER, European Waste Code, and the Code 17 that identifies construction and demolition waste is the big stick. The second one is Code 19, is mainly wastewater sludge or waste coming from a wastewater treatment. But the biggest part is constituted by construction and demolition waste. So it is a priority number 1 to be tackled at a national level. This is luckily we have quite a high rate of recycling of construction and demolition waste in Italy. And we have 2 years ago in 2019, a percentage of 78% of recycling, excluded also backfilling, so quite a high performance. We have already said that according to the Italian Court of Cassation, construction and demolition residues cannot be considered never as a byproduct, because demolition is not a production process. So after demolition, this material should be considered definitely as a waste and managed as a waste. How do we manage permitting of waste recycling installation of construction and demolition waste? As I mentioned also yesterday, we have different possibilities. Of course, we can have waste management installation falling under ID installation, or they cannot fall, that do not fall under ID installation, so they should be authorized under the Waste Framework Directive. The problem so far in Italy is that we will have probably in the coming months a national decree for end of waste. So once we recycle construction and demolition waste, we are obtaining a new product, an end of waste, but in this moment we have a lack of European and national decree. So every competent authority should issue case-by-case permit, and this means that should identify by themselves environmental and technical standards. There is another procedure that is the exemption from permit requirements that we call simplified procedure. So operator can can choose to apply for a simplified procedure, meaning that they don't have to grant a permit, an authorization, but they are just simply have to communicate to the competent authority that they intend to start an activity on construction and demolition waste recycling. And this communication, or also the permit, as mentioned yesterday, should be collected in a national database called RECER, that is a national register for recycling activities. So it's the operator that has the opportunity to choose between the ordinary procedure, that means granting a permit, ID, either ID or not ID, or choose for the simplified procedure. And if he chooses for the simplified procedure, of course, it's an advantage for him, and the burden of proof rests on the operator that is invoking this facilitated regime. So every time that the inspection authority asks for documents, he has to justify how he complies with the requirements of the general binding rules for simplified procedure. According to this simplified procedure, he just has to communicate the start of the activity, and after 90 days he can start. This communication is registered by the competent authority and can be renewed every 5 years. He just has to pay a fee, and then he has to comply with general binding rules. The content of the communication is predefined, so he has to set in this communication, indicate the compliance with the technical standards and set in these general binding rules. He has to describe the recovery process, the activities performed in his installation, the capacity of the installation itself, if they are going to use some mobile plants, and the quantity also of accepted waste. That is because if he chooses for the simplified procedure, he has to comply with quantity limits, limited numbers of waste codes that can enter the installation, and he has to comply also with the technical and environmental standards that are set in these general binding rules. So the general binding rules specify all these criteria that should be complied, related to allowed waste, the origin also of the waste, the characteristics, the quantity, the maximum quantity that is set in the general binding rules, and also the standards. Included the environmental standard that usually is a leaching test. So the first category of waste that is admitted to this simplified procedure is the code 170202, that is glass, that can be found in construction and demolition waste. And these general binding rules indicate what should be the recycling activity, what should be the characteristic of the final product, and also the environmental standard. So in this case, glass should become glass product in the form usually marketed. And the recycling activity is that this glass should directly be recovered in glass factories. Another category that is allowed to the simplified procedure is plastic contained in demolition waste, so 170203. The technical standard is the Uniplast national standard 10667, that is indicate which are the technical conditions to be complied with, and the treatment is the code R3. So the treatment to obtain plastic complying to this national standard. Then we have the category of ceramic and inert waste, so all is belonging to category 7, and we have concrete, bricks, tiles, gypsum, mixed construction demolition waste. The maximum allowed quantity, if you want to choose the simplified procedure is 120,000 of tons per year, not more. If you want to treat more, then you cannot, you have to go for the ordinary process, so have a permit under ID or Waste Framework Directive. The origin should be demolition and construction activities. The characteristics should be of the waste should be inert, brick and ceramic, with also the presence admitted of some impurities like plastic and paper, insulator, but not asbestos in this case. There are different possibilities of recycling activities admitted to simplified procedure. The first one is just storage. And the second one is R5, so obtaining secondary raw material with one of the treatment that is listed in these general binding rules, like mechanical grinding, sieving, particle site selection, and the technical standard is also defined with the leaching test. We will see which are the limit. Another possibility of recycling of this construction and demolition waste is environmental recovery, so mainly backfilling, but in this case as well, leaching tests should be complied with, and there are other authorities putting other limits about the content of contaminants in the material itself. And this operation has the code R10 according to the Waste Directive, that is recovery in environment. A third possibility is recycling the construction and demolition waste in the construction of road, airport, so foundations, industrial yards, and so on. And this is R5 operation, and again, the leaching test is the environmental standard. As far as the technical standards, they are set in this national decree. And this national decree is also the reference for green public procurement. In the case of construction and demolition waste, green public procurement is mandatory. So it's mandatory in every public purchase to have a certain percentage, I think 15%, then it's also depend on the kind of recovered material, 15% of recovered materials. And also selective demolition is mandatory, and it is one of the requirements of green public procurement. So at the moment of the tender, the operator should include a proposal, an offer, stating which is the amount of the recycling material that should be included in the construction of the building, and also presenting a plan for the dismantling of the building and the possibility of selective demolition and the quantity of the material that can be recovered. So not only inert material, but also glass, iron, and so on. I think that for the quantity of steel, for example, or iron, the percentage of recovery material to be included in a mandatory way is 70%, so quite high. So in this case, green public procurement is definitely mandatory. So this decree, also used for GPP, defines the technical standards, but it's a decree dating back to 2005, so quite old. In the meantime, new national and international standards have risen, also for material to be used in buildings and road construction and so on. And so this decree, at some extent, has been replaced by new international standards. It still remains valid for the use for recovery in environment, directly in environment, stating some characteristics. It's in Italian, but just to say that there are some thresholds related to contaminants, to impurities, to also the granulometry, for example, the content of glass, the content of paper or wood. There are some percentage. And there are also the standards for how to prove, how to test, and how to check these quantities. The general binding rules also set conditions to how to perform the leaching test. So there is a standard for sampling. So the sampling of the waste should be performed according to this standard, and also the sampling plan should be drafted. The method for the leaching test, and this analysis should be performed at least one per year, every 12 months. These are the concentration limits for the leaching test related to the different contaminants, mainly metals, but also sulfate, fluorine, chlorine, and so on. So there are thresholds for each of them. What about storage of construction and demolition waste? You can store construction and demolition waste at the production site at the production site, so where there is the dismantling of the building. You can have storage installation authorized as R13, and of course you can also store the material at the recycling material installation. According to these general binding rules, there are quantity limits also for storage capacity. If you want to overcome the storage capacity, then you have to go for the ordinary process. And also the characteristics of the waste storage should comply with some general binding rules setting technical requirements for the storage. There is also an exemption, so you should not be granted with an authorization for the deposit, for the storage of this material, and there are some limits according to the Italian legislation. So if you want to store this material at the production site, you can do without any kind of authorization if you put away this material every 3 months, or according also if you don't overcome 30 tons of non-hazardous material. Mobile plants, we know that a lot of construction and demolition recovery is done with mobile plants. So mobile recycling plants, of course, have the characteristics of mobility, so they can be transported in different places where it's needed. And they required a double process of authorization. The first ordinary authorization should be granted to the company in the place, in the region where there is the official business company. Then, so the society can be, for example, in the north of Italy, and the mobile plant can do a work in Sardinia, for example. So they need one permit in the region of the business location, and then they need to communicate, just a communication of the start of the operation in the place where the mobile plant has been located to do the work. And in this case, after 20 days from this communication, they can start this operation. The region where the mobile plant is located can also give supplementary prescriptions to these activities. Last but not least, maybe most important, all the operators are waiting for this national decree that is going to be issued. A long debate was in place in Italy related to the identification of the technical and environmental conditions. We are going to have a national decree for the recycling of construction and demolition waste, meaning that we are avoiding those long problems of giving case-by-case permit, identifying different standards from a technical point of view, of environmental point of view, and different application and conditions, not only in regions, but yes, also in region one, also beside region one, at different criteria. So this national decree that is in a draft form is going to set which waste is allowed to enter a recycling facility for construction and demolition waste, which are the checks at the incoming waste that should be performed by the operator, which are the technologies that should be used, which are the technical standards for the product, and of course according to the final use, how to comply with the conditions and the criteria set also in the national and international legislation for end of waste. The declaration of conformity should be always required for the product to be marketed. Which are the conditions for the leaching test and which are the method for sampling. As far as the leaching test, one of the points that was most discussed was the limit for sulfate and chlorine, because sulfate is mainly highly contained in construction and demolition waste when you have gypsum in a lot of buildings. So in most of cases, this in the general binding rule, the limit for sulfate was something that they couldn't comply with, and so this was hindering the capacity and the possibility to recover the material according to those limits and to come back with a product and not a waste anymore. So chlorides and sulfate has been object of compromise between public authorities and businesses. There was also a study on risk assessment that allowed to state and to define a new threshold for these two elements. It was already mentioned yesterday, soil and stones can be considered as byproduct, so there are different possibilities according to our legislation. It could be not a waste at all if it's not contaminated and it will be used in the same place where it is excavated, can be considered as a byproduct in a certain particular condition and to be reused. Also, there are some criteria to be complied and notification to the competent authority. If these criteria are not complied, then soil and stone should be considered as a waste, and there is still the opportunity to be recycled and obtained, and the product can be obtained again and put in the market. To sum up, drivers for increasing recycling of construction and demolition waste in Italy, for sure, the enforcement of green public procurement is one of the main roads to be followed. It's already in place but can be strengthened. We already have some regions setting guidelines and indication for selective demolition, but it should be strengthened in the national legislation. We want also to include in the price list of the construction works the voice recycled aggregate. Now there is not, you know, that for every kind of construction you have to refer to this list of construction work price, and recycled aggregate are not in the list, so we want to include it. And the development of end of waste criteria, of course, is crucial to give the same homogeneous criteria to competent authorities and businesses. We already have some guidelines. I want to mention one guideline for the network of environmental agencies to defining criteria related to how recover construction and demolition waste. And one very important and quite recent, 2 years ago, it's a national standard about the criteria to be followed for selective demolition. That's very important, also together with some already regional legislation defining conditions for selective demolition. Thank you.
Thank you, Romano. I'm opening the floor for questions or for comments. Sardinian.
Teşekkürler. Evet. Teşekkürler bu ilginç sunum için. 2 tane sorum olacak. Sondan başlayayım. İtalya'da yapılanlardan bahsettiniz. Ama malzeme ocaklarının açılması, yani madenlerin kullanımı ile ilgili de bir döngüselliği arttırıcı bazı tedbirler alınıyor mu? Yani geri dönüştürülmüş agrega kullanımını teşvik etmeye yönelik, doğal agrega kullanımını kısıtlamaya yönelik bir politika var mı? Bizde kolaylıkla açılabiliyor çünkü bir ülkemizde kolaylıkla malzeme ocağı açılabiliyor ve ucuz. Dolayısıyla atağa yönlendirmesi biraz zor.
Do you mean waste from mines? So the use of waste from mines? From quarries, so inert from yeah. There is another legislation because it's not under Waste Framework Directive. Also, we have a table on that at regional level, and we are discussing about the possibility to reuse that material. In this moment, the big discussion is that waste from mines activities are not under ID. They are under another legislation, so they cannot enter the cycle of end of waste recycling activities because they are not waste management activities.
Aslında maden atıklarıyla ilgili değil sorum. Madenlerin çıkarılması, daha doğrusu doğal agreganın, taş ocaklarının açılması ve onların çıkarılması ile ilgili döngüselliği destekleyici bir kısıtlama politikası var mı?
There is, as far as I know, it's not exactly in my field, but as far as I know, we have, every region has its own plan for quarries and mines, according also to the needs. So there are, I understand, well, mines are managed at national level, so the responsibility is at national level. Quarries are at regional level. I know there is a plan defining which is the maximum capacity allowed in terms of areas and in terms of quantity that can be extracted. And also are related, of course, there are measures related to the management of the waste and the recovery plans. As far as I know, there is not a policy to encourage or neither to avoid also the extraction of raw materials. It's just about the plan and what the plan allows to do.
Teşekkürler. İkinci sorum da sunumdaki leach testi zannediyorum landfill direktifindeki, düzenli depolama direktifinin ekindeki eluat testi. Doğru mudur?
Leaching test is also in the landfill directive. It's the same leaching test. What is different are the threshold limits and parameters. They are different, but probably the methodic is the same. This general binding rule that I mentioned is quite old. Is 1998. Dates 1998. So the big discussion that we have is that it is now, it's sort of panacea. I mean, if it complies with the leaching test, then it's environmental friendly. And because we don't have other tools. And so there are a lot of studies telling that, stating that this criteria of leaching test is old, doesn't say exactly if it's harmful or not, and they want to reply. So now they're trying to switch, or they would like to include in the new end of waste decree the ecotoxicity test. So there is a big discussion if keeping the leaching test or going to the ecotoxicity test, because the leaching test is quite old and it's adopted because you don't have any other tool. Risk assessment is another way. That's more used in UK or in the north of Europe. It's another approach. Usually we are used to have numbers that we want to comply with and to check if we are up on, or down the threshold. What I want to add is also that according to the experience that I have as an inspector, unfortunately, still most of the recycling activities of construction and demolition waste, as I also told yesterday, do the businesses accepting the waste, not recycling the waste. So they make money because they accept the waste, they are just maybe sieving, maybe crushing, but in the end they are not using at all this product, and they are landfilling, because usually the owner of old quarries are those who are using these recycling activities, and they are just crushing the material to fill in the quarry, their quarry.
Teşekkürler.
There's a question.
Sunum için teşekkür ediyorum ben de. Aslında 2 tane sorum olacak birbiriyle alakalı. Şimdi sunumun sonlarında toprak taşı olarak tanımlanan atıkları, daha doğrusu bir kısmının atık olmadığını, yan ürün olduğunu belirttiniz. Sunumun başında da geri kazanım oranlarından bahsettiniz. 17'li kodlu atıkların işte %76'dan 78'e doğru bir geri kazanımdaki artışı, bu atıkların geri kazanımdaki artışından bahsettiniz. Bu geri kazanım içerisinde 17 kodlar arasında toprak taşı olarak tanımladığımız atıklar var mı? Birincisi bunu soracağım. Diğer soruda geri kazanım sonucunda elde ettiğiniz ürünlerin kullanım alanları için zorunlu bir kullanım var mı? Eğer zorunlu kullanım varsa oran nedir? Zorunlu kullanım oranı. Yoksa geri kazanılmış ürün kullanımına ilişkin bir teşviğiniz var mı uyguladığınız? Teşekkürler.
As far as the first question, yes, soil and stone is 17 code. It's something, of course, different from construction and demolition. That's why construction and demolition cannot be considered as a byproduct, while soil and stone, we have a specific decree for byproducts. And so it can, under certain condition, it can be considered as byproduct. Under other condition, it cannot, it's not a waste at all, so it can be used without any reference to waste directive or byproduct also decree. In the last cases, it should be considered as a waste and then can be recycled. So yes, it's 17. As far as the use, the main use that I see, of course, is again in building activities, in road construction, for example. So in that's luckily is where we have a lot of international and also national standards to be complied. It's not mandatory where you are going to reuse this material. Usually it's used in for building construction, road construction. As far as the incentives, as far as I know, there are no particular incentives. There is a ban of putting this material, of course, in landfill. That's why we are requiring now to all the landfills, and we did an inspection campaign right last year to justify in the basic characterization exactly why that material has been landfilled instead of being recovered, because we still see a lot of construction and demolition inert waste that can be recycled to go to our landfill. So in this respect, there is this ban, and we are trying also to do some promotion with and also enforce operators also of the landfill to avoid landfilling something that can be recycled. I don't know if I properly answered to the second question, because I lost part of your question, but I don't know if I replied.
Ben de teşekkür ederim sunumunuz için. İtalya uygulamasını dinlemek ilginç oldu bizim için. Sunumda bahsettiğiniz basitleştirilmiş izin prosedürü, endüstriyel emisyonlar direktifi kapsamındaki izin prosedürü dışında kalan bir prosedür mü? Yani belirttiğiniz kapasitelerin üzerindeki tesisler için yine endüstriyel emisyonlar direktifine mi tabi tutuluyor bu tesisler? Teşekkürler.
It's not related to ID. It's a sort of general binding rules for recycling activities, not only for construction and demolition waste. There are different categories of waste that can be recycled, and these general binding rules define which are the waste allowed to certain particular waste recycling process, and which are the products that should be obtained, and also which are the technical standards and environmental standards. But it also defines the quantities of waste that are allowed to the treatment and that you can store. So if the operator is able and can stay under the limits of this decree and comply with this decree, he can choose to have this simplified procedure instead of obtaining a permit. And this permit can be under ID or can be under a waste framework directive. It's its choice. But if it goes above the limits because the capacity treatment is exceeding the limit of the general binding rules, then he is obliged to go to an ordinary procedure, so obtaining an ID or a waste permit. But it's not about ID, it's just about recycling installations.